thank you so much for your patience while we handled our IT situation. And those of you who are viewing on your computers, welcome back. Thank you again for your patience. So as we continue with our first session of today's workshop, I'm delighted to be able to introduce two friends and colleagues of mine who I've actually known for quite a while, and it's a real pleasure to have this chance to talk with them about their work. Just as a note, we'll have a conversation, and that will kind of be the format initially of this session, but of course, for those of you who are in the audience here on campus or Zooming in at home, we'll then have time for questions at the end, and if you are Zooming in, please add your questions through the Q&A function, and I'll read them out to Ruth so that we can all participate, I guess, and keep thinking about those questions as we move along. So, it's my pleasure to introduce Karen Downey, who is a visitor at the ANU School of History and a research associate in the Gendered Excellence in the Social Sciences project. And obviously, Karen is well known to the ANU crew, as well as those of you who have been involved in the Australian Historical Association. And the book that she's going to be, I suppose, sharing with us today is Tears, Laughter, Champagne, a story of friendship forged through fire and food, which I will be hearing more about shortly. On my left is my friend Cameron Muir, who, again, needs a little introduction to the ANU crowd. We know that he is highly awarded and praised for his writings, whether that's through the New South Wales Premier's History Awards, Eureka Prize for Science Journalism, all these sorts of wonderful achievements. And the book that he's going to be sharing with us today is one that he's worked on with Kirsten Weiner and Jenny Muir, Living with the Anthropocene, Love, Loss and Hope in the Face of Environmental Crisis, which has only relatively recently come out. So we've got two wonderful books to talk about today. So perhaps, starting with you, Karen, can you tell us where this book came from?
Excuse me, it came from the 2003 Canberra bushfires. I was raising children in Western Creek when fires came through, and was one of the families who lost their homes and everything along with it. There was a group of families through the school that came together after the fires and really supported each other through it. And we're actually having dinner together again on Saturday night, which we've done regularly for the past 17 years or however long it is now. When we all got back into our homes, we got together regularly for lunches, we bought food, we realised we're all pretty damn good cooks. And discussing all of the kindnesses that we'd received after the fires, we really wanted to do something to pay that back a little. And someone said we should do a cookbook. So this idea sat around for a very long time. Facing the 15th anniversary of the fires, I thought I'd get to do something about it. And I also realised that at that time I had much more to say than just a collection of recipes. I had this experience of 15 years on a journey of recovery. So I bit the bullet, and I used that word advisedly because it was quite painful, the process, and did it, and got the book out for the 15th anniversary.
I'll come back to you and ask how that actually worked and how it came together in just a moment. How about you, Cameron? Where does this book come from?
Well, Kirsten, Jenny and I have been speaking to people as part of our research as curators and writers, people who felt, bearing the burden of environmental change in our other places, like people in the gas fields, talking about irrigators saying losing their water. I felt that no one was listening to them, and Jenny was speaking to school kids who were saying adults aren't listening to us. And this was happening sort of all around Australia, and everyone felt so isolated, alone. There are many people sort of facing these things. And I thought, can we bring all these stories together? And at one stage, it was planned to be like a touring program, and we were going to go around and gather all these stories, but that fell through, and the book was sort of what we could do instead. And yeah, I guess it turned out more literary than the original conception, but that's what we chose to do because we could manage that and do that.
So two books that are really, I suppose, trying to deal with loss and trying to make something of, I guess, predicament of the challenges that we're facing and working through, I suppose, those emotions and the experiences through writing and through coming together in all sorts of different ways. And in these books, I guess we have lasting, I guess, artifacts of that experience and process. You mentioned, Karen, that was a difficult process, of course, and I wasn't aware that you've been so personally affected by the fires. Can you tell us a bit more about how that actually came to pass? I mean, 15 years on, so, I can understand why it took that time.
Yeah, it became emotional labour on quite a number of levels. First of all, there was collecting the stories where I actually interviewed the 8 other women. And I was astounded at the vulnerability and honesty that they brought to those interviews and the burden that I was carrying to tell those stories justly. Also very aware that it wasn't only our stories. We had husbands and children. There were others involved. And there's stories that I really couldn't tell. So there was a balance there. There was the constant sort of reliving of the trauma of the day and doing various traumas after. And that continued also into the publicity rounds that we did. Every time we got into a radio studio, as much as the book is mostly focused on recovery, the optimism, the hope that you will get through this, all they wanted to do was talk about the trauma of the day. I was particularly worried for the sister, the Singe sister, who did most of that publicity with me because she nearly died in her house on that day. So there's all of that working. Then on the other side, there was the writing process because this was so different to all of the academic writing that I've been doing. I realised my audience was my sisters, their families, the community. They weren't going to be interested in complexity and nuance. And in the end, I had to give in and just bring out the drama of the day and the trauma to convey the message that I wanted to convey. So it was conscious. In academic writing, I think we tend to steer away from being too emotional because it seems to get in the way of some objectivity and authority, which is probably not the case. But we're not comfortable in deploying emotions in our writing.
Just on that note, though, I mean, that's something that perhaps is one element that might have surprised you on the writing journey. But were there stories that came out in the process of writing this that you hadn't heard from the sisters or that you weren't aware of, and then as that writing process happened?
It was the stories of the day that I hadn't heard before because we didn't tend to discuss that. We were more focused in our relationships on getting each other through the aftermath. So the actual details of the day and the detail of the day, how clear that all is still that many years later. Also, I did question them on how those stories have sort of changed over time, how they've changed in being related over and over to everybody who wants to hear it, and how those stories actually become integrated into the larger story of your life, which is, I think, Robert Kenny draws on Genet, the work of Genet, in Memory and Trauma, and talks about how trauma needs to become part of the narrative to be reconciled in your life.
Yeah, he really does meditate on not even healing, it's the real sort of raw emotions that he has to months, years after. So Cameron, how about you? How did this actually come to work out as you shifted, I suppose, genre and process in the making of this book? What was involved?
Well, we were really interested in personal stories, and we knew it was going to be a little bit trickier now that we couldn't go and do workshops and work with people directly to get that, draw those stories out. So we made a call we asked for either short object stories, so people could choose an object relating to their place and use that object to tell a story about how that place is changing and how they feel about those changes, what they're doing about it, if they can do it. And the other part, we asked for essays where people could look at the themes and really try and explain what's going on, or try and figure out what's going on, what it feels to live, what it means to live in these times, rapid environmental change. And I think, yeah, some people were uncomfortable writing the first person. We had to, because for various reasons, unfamiliarity, especially if you're from a scholarly background. But other people, especially in rural areas, thought that their personal thoughts weren't of really of value. And so they often wrote like in report style. And they go, no, like how you feel about your place and what you think is important is what we're after, because we're trying to elevate those local places and say that they're worth, consideration and care and protection as well.
Was there any sort of standout moment in that process where, again, you were surprised with what someone came out with, or what effect that object or place was having on them? Was there anything unexpected that emerged?
I think we hoped that people would be really open and pull their heart out, and that happened. Jenny and Kirsten really wanted lots of positive stories. They wanted this to be people doing practical things in their everyday life to get on with, facing all these things and how to organise together and make changes like that. But most of the stories, even though there are stories about people doing direct political action and so forth, most of the stories are pretty elegiac, and people express their grief as part of that. And we said, well, that's how people are feeling. That's what we have to make it about. Yeah. But in any individual stories, I don't know. John Dargale wrote. I asked him to write a piece for it, and he wrote this great little piece on Lyden's Flat and the reserve there. But it was talking about the science, the different science and so forth, how it came to be. That reserve as an experiment type thing, and I sent it back to him and said, no, John, I want you to talk about how you feel about this. And then he came back with this really stunning piece about his been feeling torn, like this ugly fence and ambivalent about the status of nature. Yeah.
But an unlikely contribution, perhaps, not what you were expecting from him.
I was, I don't know. What he first submitted was great, and then he did this really fantastic thing by him.
He tapped into something else that he didn't know perhaps they even had.
Maybe.
Yeah, it sounds like many of your authors were looking for some kind of outlet and to be listened to, even if they weren't even sure that their experience mattered, or they hadn't felt that it mattered. And then finally, perhaps you guys came along at the right time for them. The process. Did people come back to you with a sense of how that process had affected them?
I think, in some of the emails we've received from the contributors, they definitely felt part of something, and that they, just this sort of camaraderie around being able to express how people feel. I was going to talk about this later, but
sure,
there was at the time, it really felt like there were, especially the communication researchers, talking about which emotions were valid and which weren't.
Oh.
So there was some saying that if you feel grief or anger, that's demotivating, and if you feel hope, that's an empty emotion that doesn't lead to action. And there's all this debate, and it's like we just want to create a space where whatever you're feeling, that's probably the right response to what's happening. And so we're trying to make a place where people can come together and express how they feel, and and draw strength and resolve from sharing those emotions.
Sure, we'll come back to that in a minute, Cameron. That's quite, yeah, it's interesting the ways in which that kind of, I guess, scholarly research can just so quickly just, yeah, be demoralising in itself. Like, oh, well, I'm not that.
Yeah.
Remarkable. Karen, you talked about the kind of responsibility, emotional labour that went into the book. Can you tell me a little bit more about, I suppose, the role that you're clearly working with emotions, but there's also champagne, there's also laughter here. What are some of the more, I suppose, hopeful elements that are coming out of the process of working together with your senior sisters?
I think it picks up a little on what Cameron's just been talking about, of being in it together. There were the tears, but there was so much laughter.
And lucky.
And absolutely, because we could say things to each other that nobody else would even contemplate saying. That was really important for us.
Yeah.
And it meant too that in the beginning there was a larger group of just people in Western Creek who'd all been affected. But a lot of them had lost gardens and when they replanted and cleaned up and got the electricity back on, and we were still sitting there with nothing. And then we started to rebuild and talk about toilets and taps, and the others all sort of drifted away because they weren't sharing quite the same experience. Even though they went through a really tough time because they had to sit in their old houses in a construction site that was just a dust bowl for 2 years. And, in some ways I think they had it even worse. But we were strong together. We all did go back and rebuild, and we may not have done that if we didn't have this group. We were doing it all together. And in many ways we have felt like we have flourished. We've all taken on things that we might have thought about, but would have been too cautious. And now, as my friend Liz said, she feels the fear and does it anyway. And a lot of us have done that. We've gone back to further study, we've taken on volunteering work, really pushed and challenged ourselves. But releasing the book and getting to talk to so many people in the community through that process, people were suffering badly 15 years on. We were contacted by a mental health practitioner who was still seeing someone who would have got a lot of support out of a group like ours, and could they join? It's like, we're not a support group, we're just a group of friends. And you can't artificially impose that. If you don't have the community strength beforehand, you have a very small chance of building it after. So that's an important message out of all of this. We had a neighbour of one of the senior sisters go on Facebook and complain that she wasn't invited into the group, and she's been suffering ever since. It was still a powder keg of emotions 15 years on.
And no doubt the sense of, that, I suppose, element of loss, perhaps jealousy, and not in a judgmental way, but just an envy for the kind of flourishing in that community that you guys have, that you forged with your group, that sense of wanting that, and that must have just been so hard for the neighbours that didn't have such a similar. Yeah. You can understand, of course.
Oh, perfectly understandable. But none of us are actually trained to deal with other people's trauma. No. And that's, I think, something that a lot of us will find ourselves in. All of your contributors are finding themselves in. We don't know how to deal with our own emotions, let alone the emotions and vulnerabilities of the people that we're working with. And it's not even just the subjects of our research anymore. It's us as researchers and our colleagues.
So, Cameron, I'm really interested in the ways in which this book has become an outlet for people, and given that there was I suppose, a material culture element that was one of the, I guess, starting points for this collection, and you've got curators as your colleagues there. How does that, I suppose, genre shift from display and that kind of museum context play out in book form?
Yeah, no, there was definitely, because when we had all the contributions spread out everywhere, we spent days trying to structure it and everything, and there was definitely the curatorial skills of Kirsten and Jenny definitely came into it. Definitely a curatorial project, all about the sort of literary qualities or anything. There's different juxtapositions of different objects and how they related to each other and different themes. It was all this really entangled sort of process. But I still when I think of all the contributions, I still think of it kind of spatially in a way that because people have chosen so many varied objects and the way they relate to the material, and they're really diverse, really diverse objects. That you have a soup pit, and other people have just things in their backyard. Actually, Hay had the colour purple, which is the purple for the Bureau of Meteorology, the new colour because it's so hot, and that was the object as an object. That's what she chose, and it's getting spread. So I think the Anthropocene, when it was the term was becoming really popular, it was sort of planetary and abstract, and we were trying to make it local to see how our various material connections to the world are all part of the Anthropocene as well. But Jenny was actually after the bush, so it was all done. The book was all done before the bushfires last year, and Jenny was actually trapped in Tobago with her family, and we lost contact with her for a few days. And then a lot of the contributors wrote to us and said, "No, we need to up the scale of our pieces. Like these are just these are small every day, but this is it's happening now."
Urgency.
Yeah. And we said, well, partly was we couldn't. But it was also we decided no, it's the gradual cumulative changes in our everyday lives, everyday sort of things that don't get attention all the time. These are the things that also create the emphasis. So let's keep it at that scale.
That really picks up on something that you were saying, Karen, how so much of the attention, publicity around the book and just generally is about the event, about the traumatic event, just like bushfires most recently. And yet it's that every day, it's the 15 years, it's that process, it's that long healing. How does that, I suppose there's the mundane or the ordinary that isn't getting touched there. Is that something that you pick up on?
I hope that I do, because disasters continue to live with you. Just the things that years later you will go to put your hands on something and it's not there. Some of the women even talked about going to a particular place in their new home to get something, but that was the place where it used to be in the old house, right? Even just that sort of spatial awareness. But as you go through life, you get to, just really mundane things like kids are leaving home. Well, you might go and get them the old bar fridge in the shed to help them out in a new flat. We had nothing that was old. There is a constant reminder of that disruption that we had at that time. So it's an accumulation of mundane things. So I think the healing process is much like any relationship. The healing process is the relationship to the event, and it's a work in progress. It's an everyday thing.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting that picking up on the how everything is new, and then we've got the focus on the material culture elements in your book. Did you expect yourself to be sentimental or attached to something like a bathroom or those sorts of things that are just part of a house that you certainly aren't going to prioritise staying in, but they remind us of it?
Different people are more attached to material objects than others. I'm not, and I'm even less so now. And I wasn't alone in that. There was at least two other distinguished sisters who agreed with me. We felt this incredible lightness after fires. One Jane expressed it as she didn't realise how heavy her things were. once we freed ourselves of all of that, actually the sense of possibility, it's like you've got quickly shut down. You've got families and kids, and you have to go on with normal life. And a lot of us report now that we get claustrophobic with material stuff. It continues to accumulate and it continues to be heavy. So I think that's actually an interesting lesson that's come out of that. The things that people regretted losing were very varied. The one thing I went looking for was a charm bracelet that I'd collected through my childhood. My father was in foreign affairs. We travelled the world. I spent my pocket money collecting silver charms. My bracelet was, had 2 charms on every ring, and it was the story of my life. And I didn't even find the melted part of it, and that just had gone. Another friend had recently, taken all of the furniture from a dying parent, and the sideboard that had survived the French Revolution didn't survive an Australian bushfire. There was some guilt in that as well. So we have strange and complex relationships to the objects in our lives.
Incredibly moving. Thanks, Claire. I think what's really striking me also is this connection to place and this local feel, and how people are communicating that through their experiences. How are some of the contributors in the Anthropocene was negotiating the changes that they're seeing? Is it obviously there's the emotional side of things, but how are they in practice or in their lives dealing with this?
Yeah, well, it's really varied. I think so. So I guess one of the most sort of literary contributions is from Sylvia Falconer, who talks about interpreting all the signs of change, both in Sydney where she lives and through all the images she sees on social media, where everything was this aesthetic and this is all this weirdness. And she spent a lot of time tracing it, quite really trying to process all of that, understand these changes. And on the other hand, so choosing 2 very different contributions here. On the other hand, Ray Thompson from out in New England, he spent 30 years restoring or regenerating stolen soils. So even before the Federation drought, sheep went out there and just locally, like all the vegetation is locally, and these massive clay pans where you can go to the edge of it, but you can see the soil's gone, like that much is gone. And they're really huge, and I've forgotten how many thousands of hectares. It's like, I can't remember. Was it 30,000 hectares or something? I don't know, because we were talking about it on the phone the other day.
It was vast.
Yeah, it was vast. So just out there surveying it all and doing this technique where it just raises the soil in this U shape and they reseeds it with saltbush and maybe grasses, and you see him in one photo there's just vast skull, and the next photo there's grass and saltbush up to his head. Like it's quite incredible. I mean, that's his response to trying to help with local place. It's 2 very different responses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's coming to terms with centuries old degeneration and destruction.
Yeah, legacies of violence and dispossession.
That's right, absolutely. And yet, there is remarkable capacity to recover if it's allowed to.
Exactly. Yeah.
Karen, I'm interested about the food element here. Like, there's that's like we talked about material possessions. We talked about the coming together. But what is it about food and the nourishing, perhaps, that's going on?
Food is, such in every culture, I think food is used to create community, bring family together. And it's the women who are mainly involved in that process. And I'm always struck, and Tom Griffiths has written about this, the very masculinist rhetoric around bushfires. We fight bushfires. the whole language is militaristic. And yet the real work that's done after the event, after the flames are put out, is this nurturing, mainly by women, and it's the everyday care through food. And that's what I wanted to bring out. And also, cookbooks are the most saleable thing on bookshelves. So, I was really thrilled to have it down at Dimmock's beside Nigella Lawson and Jenny Oliver. That was a thrill, yes.
Yeah. And there's the coming together, there's the community, there's the connecting with the whole processes of cooking and coming together. That's really quite a beautiful, I suppose, way of recognising that work, and that can mean all sorts of things. It can touch people in different ways, even if they weren't, even if they hadn't had a similar experience. That's a way of connecting beyond, I suppose, your immediate community.
That's right, and I think it taps back into the care for the environment and what we are going to lose if we don't take steps. Can we move to the Q&A?
Alrighty, thank you. So I'm going to open up to our crowd in person here, and then of course we've also got some Q&A on the chat. And lo and behold, perhaps while people here do some quick thinking, good friend Sharon Willoughby, who might be well known to you, she has zoomed in. Hello, Sharon, live from London. She's asking you, Cameron, have you thought about what stories everyday objects will tell of the pandemic?
I think we did wonder whether, because the book was actually delayed.
In volume 2.
Yeah, volume 2, yeah. I don't know if we can do 40 contributors again.
You have a full head of hair when you started.
Exactly. We did, because it was actually supposed to come out in March, and that's when the shutdown happened. And the publishers said it's too late to bring out now, and no one's going to be around to buy it. We wondered, could we include a response to the pandemic? But we couldn't do that either. But, yeah, because it would have gone to the printers. But I wonder what the signs about the pandemic have something to say about how we can work together. There's a lot. It's a really unusual time. There was this moment when everyone was in lockdown together, when it wasn't just Melbourne on their own, poor Melbourne, Victoria. When a lot of people realised, hang on, things can't go on the way they have been. There's like this moment of realisation and rethinking. And actually what's really important are our neighbours and the people at the shops and the people next to us there's suddenly a lot of parents couldn't do all the running around to a million different lessons and sports and things like that. And actually it's good to just hang out with the kids and not have all that. People didn't have to commute. Yeah.
And all that time that freed
up. Yeah. It was obviously dangerous for people to be in some households. Sure. But for the middle class, it was a moment of realisation, I think. And I think there's a lot of objects they could talk about. Different values and things, and even the mask, which has become something contested. I think it all links back to the value system around environment and climate change as well. I think there are links between all those objects.
That's a responsibility, community.
Yeah, and whether you have faith in institutions and expertise or not.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Sharon. Do you have a question from the group? Okay, Daniel and Laura.
I guess this is a question for everyone. I was wondering if you could just speak more to anger. I don't think environmental historians or environmental writers often talk about anger explicitly, although it's definitely there.
I'll just repeat that for those tuning in at home. Daniel May was asking about the role of anger that's coming through and how that's perhaps a neglected emotion in our studies, and maybe because it's so confronting.
Yeah, I've got a lot of ambivalence around anger as well. after the 2003 bushfires, there was a lot of community anger about lack of warning, lack of preparedness, all sorts of issues. Lack of communication between the ACT and New South Wales services, and so on. My family and our friends, we gave up that anger. We were never part of any of those lawsuits. We just could not go with that anger and recover and heal. And I have a feeling that the people who let the anger convey them through those few months afterwards, they have taken a lot longer to get easier in themselves and live productively. So in that sense, anger might be an emotion that is not productive or useful. But I think we have every right to be angry. And I think that anger can be a really motivating force.
What about you, Cameron? Is there a rage or an anger or a frustration in this collection?
A lot of people were frustrated with knowing the predicament we're in. Tom Griffiths has this quote about being trapped between this sort of horror and hubris. So we sort of know what needs to be done, but not doing it. We were talking, Karen and I were talking on the phone the other day, it's mainly just like the people. But everyone else understands there's huge support for the Australian population, according to polls for action and climate change. The states and cities are doing it. This federal government, Judas Brett says, captured by the fossil fuel industry. There's a lot of frustration there, which leads to people talking about their emotions. But anger is completely valid response, and I think when people see what's happening, they have the right to be angry. And I don't know that the pieces themselves are angry in the tone, because when you come to write, you sort of calm down and you're reflecting more. Writing's more reflective of art form, I guess, a quieter art form, and you're thinking of many things at once. The anger is the type of thing that motivates you down the street and protest and try and be heard that way, I guess. It doesn't often come through in the writing. Ellen Van Nieuwen, I think she's very forthright, and her anger is apparent, although it's a very reflective piece, because she's dealing with a previous apocalypse and also trying to respond to the current one. So I think she's trying to find positive ways to get other people to value her culture and make that part of regenerating and renewing and making more flourishing futures. So I think that's a contribution that might have some anger in it, but anger, and I like that piece, environmental historians have ignored all emotions in their research mostly. It's a very small part of environmental histories research, and they can work out how to study that.
Laura?
Question to Karen about, I guess thinking about the global and the local, the job is so intensely local. But was there any sort of self-consciousness also, especially among some systems, that is telling a planetary story, a bigger story? I mean, there have been fires since then about before these other communities, or have you wanted to resist that and make it entirely local?
Ruth, you don't need to repeat it. We picked it up.
Oh, you picked it up. Pardon me. Okay, sorry, Karen.
I did a limited print run. There are still copies left, but I did a limited print run. So it was mainly focused on the Canberra community. But it obviously is a larger story. And one friend brought a copy gave to her daughter, who was going off to do a political science internship at the White House and with a Californian senator. So he's got it in his office with Fiona Firth, who's one of the PhD students here after the fires, not the last ones, but the ones before. She took down a couple of boxes and they made sure it got going. Yes, the Tartar fires, thank you. So the Red Cross got them, the local libraries, the recovery centre and so forth. Yes, so I have been conscious of it. There's quite a lot of time in getting, the books out to people and mobilising, and yeah, so I probably could do more of that.
I think there's something really special though in the way that the book is so local when we have, that's the whole sort of principle behind your book is sort of connecting these enormous abstract concepts to local experience, and that's exactly what your book is.
Yeah, and I think there is some value in giving stories back to the community from which it came.
Do you have any sense, and I'll just jump in, of how people who have experienced bushfires at other points in time have responded? Or
no, nobody's come up, nobody's sort of come to me and talked about previous experiences. So it's quite hair-raising the number of people who've been involved in more than one natural disaster. Been caught in floods in Brisbane and the bushfires, or fires here and then down the coast, or even in the early time afterwards. At one stage, I was in the Coom's tea room with Ingrid McFarlane, whose family lost their home in the 1980s fires in South Australia, and Robert Kenny, who lost his home in 2009 in Victoria. So just three historians in the Coom's tea room had been in 3 different bushfires. And I thought, we can't talk about if this happens, we have to start talking about when this happens. How are we going to be prepared? How are we going to get through it?
Just what you were saying there, I think, I don't know what other people's experiences of this last summer gone was, but it was almost as though there were people who got stuck in one summer. I was on Kangaroo Island, obviously the Canberra bushfires, also down at the coast, that's 3 fires. Andrew was actually, my partner was in Wenatchee when the Aurora fire started, so that's 3 or 4 in one summer, so it's becoming more of this narrative of exactly rather than if this happens, when this happens, or and do you have any reflections on this particular summer where so many people were kind of stuck in various places, or say people in Canberra who might have coast houses or families who are at the coast or in other states? Do people kind of talk to you about that, or?
They haven't specifically, but Ingrid McFarlane's on Kangaroo Island, and she was there during the fires. 3 sides of their property burned, so that's the 3rd one for her. My pragmatic response is, well, we really have to think about the way we live. Maybe we shouldn't be racing down to the coast in the middle of bushfire season and spending our summers, camping. Maybe we need to have our long holidays during the winter. There are just those sort of, very practical things that maybe we have to do. The other one is just always being prepared. I mean, we all know now about bushfire plans and getting, our environment ready, our houses, our gardens and so forth. I think we also do need to talk about, as families and as communities, what we're going to do when it happens. We have the telephone trees in place so that all the neighbours are informed, where the recovery centre will be, that it won't be there for 12 months or even 2 years, but it might need to be there for 10 years. Where are the mental health services? All of those things need to be put in place before and ongoing. We can't keep treating these as isolated disasters. They are natural disasters. That means they're always going to be there. I think we treat it a little bit like death. It's the only thing we probably all have in common. We all will die. And yet we're so loath to talk about the process of it.
Alrighty, well, I'm sorry, Joy, thank you for adding your question, but we might come back to it later in the workshop today. Could you please join me in thanking Cameron Muir and Karen Downing for a really moving discussion. Thank you for your time.